Of course, I look away as soon as it says it's time to go live. Welcome to 10 Minutes for Democracy. I'm Michael Tucker. Today, I'm going to be talking about systemic racism, especially within the context of Texas's bill, SB7. Now, the first thing you need to understand about voters by area is that in this country, there are very strong trends towards whether or not an area will support Republicans more or support Democrats more. And that area, that biggest byline, is between rural areas with low density of voters and large urban areas that have a high density of voters, be they cities or even suburban areas, even though the suburban areas are a little bit closer. So it's important to for all of this, it's important to understand that context. Now, and what happens is in 2020 election, that very much bared that out. And as we'll see, the 2020 election is a big part of the reason why we're seeing these voter, what are called by some voter suppression laws, and definitely changes to the voting systems in a lot of red states. It's very much for the recent trends that have been shown in the 2020 election. So right now, most of what these bills that we're seeing done in red states by Republican state government is what we might call voter selection, where they try to pass laws that will select for certain types of voters and away from other types of voters. And specifically for the cases of the discussion I want to have today, they're trying to select for Republican voters and away from Democratic leaning voters. Now, one of the reasons they're doing this is because Republicans more and more are coming to rely on cultural issues, which do very well in rural areas, but do very poorly in urban or high density areas. They used to also be doing more so, kind of economic conservatism, but that's very out of fashion at this point, especially considering the crises that we're facing in our society and the need for the government to act. And most people, or a clear majority of people, is understanding we need to act to improve our society and act collectively. And that's why we have government. So the conservative argument for small government and low taxes is at this point not very effective. And so they're leaning even more so than in the past 10, 20 years on cultural issues to make their case. And that fares pretty well in traditional rural communities, but does very poorly even amongst conservative leaning people in cities and high density populations. So the 2020 election was a microcosm of this. I mean, the elections in the past 20, 30 years, even when Republicans have won the federal congressional government, as well as the federal, even when they've been in control of Congress, they've generally had to do it with what they call minority majority party, which is to say they still get a minority of voters, but they get voters in the right places and in the right way that they're able to somehow still win elections. And a lot of the ways that happens is through gerrymandering, basically both sides, but Republicans have pioneered this, I think, a bit more than Democrats have, being very specific on their districts and cutting them out. And also amongst Democrats, there are a lot, and left-leaning people like myself that are actually in favor of non-partisan commissions that are kind of forced to, as much as possible, put partisan desires aside. California has that. A lot of blue states do. Most Republican states, more quote unquote red states, do not. And so the necessary change. So what Republicans are finding is that even with their targeted, their gerrymandering, the structural aspects of our government that favor rural voters and put more weight on rural voters in terms of their electoral power, still they're finding themselves in the minority. And this past 2020 election showed that, in 2018 one as well. Even though it came back, they rubber banded and bounced back a little bit in 2020, the trends are definitely bad for them. So they're sitting there saying, okay, what can we do to try to win elections? Generally, the behavior of most politicians in general, and certainly many Republican politicians that are trying to change voting laws, are very craven. They're trying, how do I change the rules so I can win? And so one way that they're trying to change the rules now is in Texas, as with any other states, is with changing who votes and how easy or difficult it is for them to vote. So Now it gets us to Texas Bill SB7. And so Ari Berman, who wrote this wonderful book called Give Us the Ballot, I follow him on Twitter. There we go. He tweeted out a very interesting fact about the one aspect of SB7 and what it would do to polling places in Texas. So let me pull it up. Okay, that's all that. I want to have me in the little corner a little bit. Hold up. Nope, that's mostly the thing. Okay, there you go. Okay, so here we go. So Texas Bill SB7. One thing it's going to do in one way that looks like Republicans are trying to further kind of tilt the scales in Texas towards rural voters is by decreasing the number of polling places in large urban Democratic leaning counties. And so you see here at the top, they have the ones that, not in the red, are the ones that has to do with the degree of change in the polling places. So the -11's in red because that's the biggest change. Now that one favors the Democrats. And if you see here, if you scroll down a little bit now, you see almost all the top 3, 6, 9, 12, like 14 ones that are decreasing polling places. Every single one are districts that favor Democrats and are tended to be urban. If you look at their percentages, you got high numbers of the registered voting population. I mean the registered voter actually is pretty even there, but they're definitely favoring they're favoring urban Democratic counties there. And you see all of those, and there are a few Democratic ones +4 and +9 towards the bottom. But generally speaking, it's pretty obvious the partisan turn that this is making. It's focusing on decreasing polling places in Democratic counties, increasing in Republican ones. That, as Ari Berman points out, also trends along the urban and versus rural areas. And so you see here, and one thing he points out, but actually for this argument, I'm going to try not to focus too much on, but one thing that he does point out here is the white voting age population and how low it is in particular in all those Democratic districts. Again, for the purposes of this, we'll assume that the Republicans are merely being so craven as to focus on the counties that have the highest margin in favor of Democrats and are looking specifically at the race or ethnicity of the voters. But as you see here, looking at it in terms of the effect is going to be in the districts that are losing polling places. Those are places that do not have a lot of white voters, which means those are majority black, brown voting districts. And so you're seeing that clearly here. And so I saw this a few days ago on my Twitter. I said, I have to talk about this. And this to me is a great microcosm of what it means when we talk about systemic racism. You see, as I said, for the purposes of what I'm talking about here today, I'm assuming that the Republicans that are in favor of this bill, who helped write it, who are trying to have this specific effect on polling places, are doing so out of craven politics, not because of any particular personal animus towards black and brown people. Now, some of them might have that, and as we'll talk about this in a minute, or they have a disregard for those issues, which is much more common. But even given that, this is what people like myself would call systemic racism. And the reason why that is that despite the motivations of the individuals that are doing this, that are specifically trying to close polling places, which would, of course, and I may not have gone into this enough, but what happens is when you close polling places, what you're doing is you're creating longer lines and a more difficult path to actually being able to vote. You are suppressing the vote through not specifically making it illegal or you're unable to vote, but simply producing more hurdles before being able to actually cast your ballot. And so long lines, several hour lines, is one of the things that does that. And we see those in a lot of red states in urban centers already, before bills like this one or the one in Georgia even took place. And what you're doing is by doing that, and you'll see if you look at those videos, you see in those lines, a lot of black and brown people in those lines, right? And so what this is doing is clearly going to make those lines longer and have the effect of ultimately decreasing the turnout numbers for those groups of people that are those black and brown people that represent a large percentage of the population in those areas. And so this is systemic racism because of the effect that it's going to have on that population, not because of the motivations of the individuals involved in doing it. As I said, their motivation can be purely partisan, purely craven for the purpose of trying to win elections. and doing so with a more and more difficult agenda to try to convince people to go along with. But given that, it's still creating a system by which being Black and brown is likely to have a negative impact on your ability to fully participate in our society. And it's doing so empirically. And so when you're talking about in our society, systemic racism, you're not talking about the personal feelings of any individuals, even those in power. What you're talking about is the effect of policy, of systems built and created for whatever purpose on Black and brown people. That's what systemic racism is, what it represents. And so when I saw this, I said, this is systemic racism. This is Republicans trying to win elections. This is them hopefully not explicitly doing this to hurt Black and brown people and to make them and to explicitly decrease their ability to vote, but just because they happen to be Democrats have that effect. But the effect that it has on Black and brown people is to make them less able to participate in our society and therefore be full, federal persons as they should be in our society. And so, this is the kind of thing where we have to get away. And that's a lot of what talking about systemic racism is getting away from the idea of pointing fingers. And it's not about pointing out who the bad guy is when you're talking about diagnosing systemic racism. Systemic racism can be done by people that are even as much as what you would call anti-racist, not on purpose. But the problem line is if you create a society with rules and with systems and structures that minimize the ability for Black and brown people to be involved in our government, in our economy, in the levers of democracy, then what you're doing is you are creating systems of systemic racism. And that's what the Texas Republicans are doing with this bill. And it's also undemocratic. And I don't like it on that basis either. I think that because here's the thing, this in particular, I'm sure they have their explanation for it, but they're also doing things like making it harder to vote by mail, which is a way around those long lines. Now, I'm in California and we have a generally fairly well-run elections. I never have to wait in lines more than like 10 minutes. But I think I still voted by mail this time because it's just easier. And there's no documented, non-zero or approximately non-zero amount of fraud. And only a little bit of fraud they found were actually from Republicans who said they did it because they assumed Democrats were doing it too. But the fact is, it's actually very safe. It's been done for decades, vote by mail. There's no documentation of any kind of systemic problems with fraud. It's just it increases turnout. And in 2020, turnout was crazy high. And that scared Republicans who know their agenda isn't popular. And they've had to win as much as they've won with minority majorities. As weird as that sounds to say, that's what they were able to do. And the more turnout there is, the harder it is to pull that off. And losing Georgia, both senators, that's a scary thing for them. That's why Georgia was the first state to pass these kind of laws. That wasn't by accident, because they see that democracy at work makes their agenda much more of a weight around their necks than it might be if turnout is lower and if the ability to vote or people being able to vote is generally harder to do. So that's what I wanted to go over as far as that's kind of how SB7 in my mind connects to systemic racism. It's building in real time right in front of us a new system for being able to disenfranchise Black and brown voters, as well as Democratic voters in general. But as I said, in the context, because that's the other thing about this is we have to be able to think about things in more than one term. So I can look at this and say, on the one hand, this is undemocratic. Everybody should be able to vote. There should be a constitutional right to vote. And in fact, it moved to amend the organization I'm involved in when that's something I've talked about with them, because I think it's critical, and it would actually be able to once again involve the federal government in protecting our federal right to be involved in our government, which I think is in the Constitution, even though it's not explicit, obviously. So that's why we need to amend the Constitution about that. But this can both be undemocratic as well as systemically racist because of the effect that it has on Black and brown people. And different various minorities. So, and that's again what I want to get away from. And that's the bigger issue now, because I think most people in our society aren't explicitly racist. They don't really, the race as a concept, as socially constructed as it is, was made real by white supremacy in our society over several hundred years. But people, young people especially, are growing out of that. But we have all these relics of existing systems, that have come out of white supremacy that are still with us. And those aren't the fault of any individual. And they aren't even the fault of the people that may even be enforcing those laws, although I won't go into policing right now, but you can have a people of a society that have mostly moved past this, or at least the majority have, but still have systems in place that make the lives of Black and brown people and minorities in general more difficult. And I want to be able to show that with SB7, that difference between a person, what they're trying to do, and the effect it might have, and how to look at systemic racism in that way. So that's wow, we got some interesting comments in the chat here. So thanks for watching. I'm going to go into the comment section now. Thanks for watching 10 Minutes for Democracy. I'm gonna look at the comments in the log in the comment section here. The comments in the video. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and click on one of the links on the sidebar that for 10 Minutes for Democracy, or go to the channel. I've got a bunch of playlists, and check me out. I'll be here every Thursday for streams, either about a specific issue like this one, or talking about the news of the day. I decided to do the specific one for this week, but we'll see what happens for next week. Anyway, thanks for watching. All right, now to the comments. So we got Alex, Connor, and Eric are all in the chat here, talking about different things. Now, Connor says, I agree with economic conservatism, but when push comes to shove, most red states are hypocrites when it comes to welfare for red states. I just wish people wouldn't push for selective policy. Okay. And that's the thing. I mean, I think that the only way that you get red states to be against the government, be it state or federal government, helping out with people, is when they try to push it as something that's only going to help minorities. That was kind of the part of the Southern strategy, welfare queens, like that guy in 1988, the prisoner that was let out and hurt some people. I can't remember his name. It was the Dukakis election. It's a way of saying, don't do nice things for everybody, including you, because it'll help the Black and brown people. That works less and less now, and people are suffering enough. It doesn't work anymore. It works in times of relative prosperity, when it's kind of convenient, and thinking about things in terms of race are almost kind of like a luxury. And once you get in these situations like now, when unemployment, even though the numbers seem better, I think, than they are, all I hear about is all these corporations, laying people off and going more online. Like, I think Best Buy is the newest one now, is cutting off a lot of employees. So I think when you get in that situation, even people in red states, they don't have time for this. They want, I think of, Florida raised minimum wage. There's another state that voted for Medicaid. It was like Kentucky, or is it Oklahoma? I don't remember which state it was. Another state that they voted through direct democracy to get Medicaid expansion. But then the government said, yes, it was, it's Willie Horton was the one I was thinking of in '88. But they did that, and the governor was like, I'm not going to do it. But it's getting to the point where even red states, big government is actually popular. It's only the culture stuff that keeps them from voting for Democrats. The next comment, Trump was an effing idiot in 2020. Had he listened to populists or just grounded advisors like Christie, he probably would have won. About a year or so, he capitulated to neocon orthodoxy. I think that's generally true. Once he was in office, the only things Trump was really allowed to do was the things the Republican Party wanted to do. The judicial nominees that they wanted from the Federal Society, the neocon stuff with the military. We just found out now that he wanted to pull out of a bunch of Middle Eastern countries, and the military just didn't do it. They just kind of cucked him, and he just went along with it. So yeah, he didn't. And also, of course, the biggest thing that hurt Trump, I think, too, was in 2020. And I made a video about this. But he had the opportunity to be the pandemic savior. If he really, besides, Operation Warp Speed was kind of aside. That had to do with the vaccine. But in terms of being on the front edge of prevention, he could have saved hundreds of thousands of American lives and guaranteed himself re-election if he'd handled the pandemic better. But he didn't. He minimized it. He purposefully, and we know this, he told Bob Woodward, he lied about how serious it was because he thought in his mind that was protecting his presidency and his image. but it ended up hurting him and almost guaranteeing his loss. It was actually surprisingly close, the election, again, because of things like the Electoral College that aren't particularly democratic, that it was actually kind of close. But he lost by 7-8 million voters. I mean, that's a monster loss in terms of practical numbers. But he had a chance. Now, Eric said something that I don't really appreciate, but I'm going to say it because he's a comment here. He says, everyone knows Black and brown voters are less capable of accomplishing relatively simple tasks, racisms. Well, I don't know if you feel like waiting in line is a complicated task. I think nobody likes waiting in line. And I think that's fundamentally what reducing number of polling stations does. It makes people wait in line for hours. And then you have passed laws that don't let them pass out water or food. So you have to stand in line for hours without food or drink, or probably not even in porta potties to go to. That's not really about skills. That's really about actually literally just trying to make it a difficult and harrowing process, especially for older people and people that might have arthritis or conditions that make it difficult to stand and move slowly for long periods of time. That has nothing to do with capability. That has to do with the human condition. So I have to say I fundamentally disagree with that comment, but thanks for coming by and listening, hearing us out. And Alex mentioned here, Oklahoma, we are privatizing after voting to expand. So that might have private management. So that's interesting. So again, it's the idea that private corporations are more efficient, when really that's only true in the sense of when you're trying to like build things cheaper and not worried about quality particularly. So yes, I think privatizing things is much better when you're not that concerned about quality. But when you're concerned about quality, like with education or with actually reducing the amount of overhead for something, privatization doesn't work very well. If you look at Medicare is like over 95% efficiency in terms of the money going into it actually going to care. Whereas like it required Obamacare to get corporate, insurance companies, medical insurance companies over 80% efficiency. So, private companies are not more efficient. They're better at decreasing their price at all costs, but sometimes the cost is quality. And for some things like healthcare and education, quality is at a premium. And so that's why those types of things I don't like to privatize, because quality is too important to leave it in a system like a private system where there's necessarily in a private system, less accountability. And those scary death panels are much more likely in a private system. We have private companies making decisions about who gets care and who doesn't. All right, well, I don't see anybody else in the comments. I appreciate everybody for stopping by. This is relatively short. I'm in the middle of another project separate from YouTube. I'm working on this past week and it's coming into this weekend. But thanks for stopping by and checking out this week in 10 Minutes for Democracy. Any more comments? No comments. Have a great evening.